The first documented disappearance in Ironwood County occurred on the night of September 14, 1987, when 14-year-old Marcus Bellamy walked out of his family's farmhouse at approximately 2:47 in the morning. His mother, Ruth, would later tell investigators that she heard the screen door creak open and assumed her son was using the outhouse. She fell back asleep. By dawn, Marcus was gone, and the only evidence of his departure was a single set of barefoot prints in the mud leading toward the eastern tree line, prints that simply stopped at the edge of the forest as though the boy had been lifted straight up into the dark canopy above. The Ironwood County Sheriff's Department conducted a search that lasted 11 days. Volunteers from 3 neighboring counties combed through nearly 40 square miles of dense pine forest, ancient oak groves, and abandoned logging roads that hadn't seen traffic since the timber industry collapsed in the 1950s. They found nothing. No clothing, no remains, no sign of struggle. Marcus Bellamy had walked into those trees and ceased to exist. His case file, number 87 to 1142, would be the first of many to accumulate in the basement of the Ironwood County Administrative Building over the following decades. By the time I arrived in the county as a freelance investigative journalist in the autumn of 2019, that basement held over 60 similar files, each one describing a person who had simply walked into the forest and vanished. The youngest was 8. The oldest was 73. They shared no common demographic, no obvious connection, no thread that might explain why they had all chosen to leave their homes in the dead of night and march into the wilderness. But they did share one thing, though it took me months to piece it together from fragmented witness statements and the reluctant testimony of locals who had learned long ago that speaking about certain things brought only trouble and suspicion. Every person who disappeared had been heard, by at least one witness, to mention a sound in the nights preceding their vanishing. A whistle. Not the whistle of wind through branches or the distant call of a train. Something else entirely. Something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that burrowed into the brain and nested there like a parasite. My name is Daniel Vance and I came to Ironwood County because of a podcast. That sounds ridiculous now, given everything that happened, but in September of 2019, I was a burned-out journalist looking for my next story, and a listener had sent me a message about a small rural community in the Pacific Northwest where people had been disappearing for over 30 years with no explanation. The message included a link to a local newspaper article from 2016 describing the disappearance of a woman named Helen Marsh, and a single sentence that would change the course of my life. They say you can hear it calling on quiet nights, and if you hear it clearly enough, you won't be able to stop yourself from following. I drove into Ironwood on a Tuesday afternoon under a sky the color of wet concrete. The town itself was barely a town at all, just a cluster of buildings arranged along a 2-lane highway that cut through the forest like a scar. There was a gas station that doubled as a general store, a diner called the Timberline, a small church with a steeple that needed painting, and a handful of houses that looked like they had been built in the 1940s and never updated since. Beyond the buildings, in every direction, the forest loomed. I had driven through plenty of rural areas in my career, but I had never experienced anything quite like the claustrophobic density of the trees that surrounded Ironwood. They seemed to press against the edges of the town, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when they might finally reclaim the land that had been cleared for human habitation. The Timberline diner was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon grease. I took a seat at the counter and ordered breakfast from a waitress named Donna who looked at me with the particular wariness that small-town residents reserve for outsiders. When I told her I was a journalist researching the disappearances, her expression shifted from wariness to something closer to resignation. "You're not the first," she said, refilling my coffee without being asked. "We get 1 or 2 of you every year. Writers, podcasters, those YouTube people. You come in asking questions, you stay for a week or 2 and then you leave. The ones who disappeared don't come back, but neither do the ones who come looking for answers." I asked her what she meant by that and she was quiet for a long moment before responding. Her voice was low, intended only for me, and the other patrons in the diner seemed to deliberately avoid looking in our direction. "There's things in those woods that don't want to be found," she said. "Things that have been here longer than any of us. My grandmother used to tell me stories when I was little, stories her grandmother told her. The old folks, the ones who settled this land, they knew better than to go into the forest after dark. They knew what was out there. But people forget. They tell themselves it's just stories, just superstition. And then one night they hear the whistling and they remember. But by then it's too late." I asked her about the whistle and she shook her head, a quick, sharp motion that made it clear the conversation was over. But before she walked away to attend to other customers, she leaned close and spoke a final sentence that I would turn over in my mind constantly in the weeks to come. "If you hear it, don't listen. Cover your ears, put in headphones, do whatever you have to do. Because once you really hear it, once you let it inside your head, there's nothing in this world that will stop you from following. I checked into the only motel in town, a 12-room establishment called the Pine Rest that sat at the northern edge of Ironwood, its back windows offering an unobstructed view of the tree line. My room was small but clean, with wood-paneled walls and a window air conditioning unit that rattled like a dying animal. I unpacked my recording equipment, my notebooks, and the files I had accumulated during my preliminary research, and I began to plan my investigation. The Ironwood County Sheriff's Department was my first official stop the following morning. The building was a single-story brick structure that shared a parking lot with the local post office, and the interior smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. Sheriff Thomas Hendricks was a large man in his early 60s with a gray mustache and hands that looked like they had spent decades doing manual labor before he ever pinned on a badge. He received me with the sort of tired politeness that suggested he had given this same interview many times before. "The disappearances are real," he told me, sitting behind a desk cluttered with paperwork. "I won't pretend otherwise. 63 people over 32 years and not a single body recovered. Not one. You know how unusual that is? People don't just vanish. There's always something. A bone, a scrap of clothing, evidence of animal activity. But these folks? Nothing. It's like the forest swallows them whole." I asked him about the patterns, if there were any, and he pulled a file from his desk and opened it to reveal a map of the county with red dots marking the last known locations of each victim. The dots formed no discernible pattern, scattered across the map like drops of blood. "We've had profilers, FBI consultants, search and rescue experts from all over the country take a look at this," he said. "They all say the same thing. There's no pattern. No common thread. Different ages, different backgrounds, different parts of the county. The only thing they have in common is that they all walked into those woods in the middle of the night and never came back." I asked him about the whistle. Sheriff Hendricks was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of the professional detachment he had maintained throughout our conversation. "Off the record?" I nodded. "I've heard it," he said. "Twice. Once when I was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, and once about 5 years ago when I was out on a night patrol. It's not like any sound I can describe. It's beautiful, Mr. Vance. That's the terrible thing about it. It's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. And when you hear it, you understand why people follow. You understand why they walk into those trees and don't come back." #block 2. My investigation began in earnest the following week. I spent my days conducting interviews, reviewing old newspaper clippings at the county library, and poring over the case files that Sheriff Hendricks had reluctantly allowed me to photocopy. In the evenings, I sat in my motel room and transcribed my recordings, slowly building a timeline of the disappearances and cataloging the testimonies of those who had witnessed their loved ones walk into the forest. The ranger station on the eastern edge of the county proved to be an invaluable resource. Forest Ranger Patricia Webb had been stationed in Ironwood for over 20 years, and her logbooks contained observations that never made it into official police reports. She was a wiry woman in her 50s with sun-weathered skin and eyes that held the particular alertness of someone who had spent most of her life in wilderness that demanded constant vigilance. "The official line is that these are isolated incidents," she told me, sitting on the porch of the ranger station with a cup of black coffee steaming in the autumn chill. "Runaways, suicides, people who got lost and succumbed to the elements. That's what we put in the reports because that's what makes sense. But the logs are different. The logs are for me, for whoever comes after me, so they know what's really out there." She led me inside and pulled a series of notebooks from a locked filing cabinet. The earliest dated back to 1998, the year she had been assigned to Ironwood, and the entries painted a picture of a forest that defied rational explanation. Entry dated March 3, 2002, read as follows. Responded to report of unusual animal activity in Sector 7. Found deer carcass approximately 2 miles from Hollow Creek Trail. Cause of death unclear. No visible wounds, no signs of predation. Animal appeared to have simply stopped living in the middle of walking. Found similar carcasses in the area, all within a rough circle approximately 100 yards in diameter. Total count, 7 deer, 3 rabbits, numerous birds. All appeared to have died simultaneously. No explanation. Reported finding to wildlife management, attributed to unknown disease. But there was no disease. I know what disease looks like. These animals just stopped. Another entry, dated November 17, 2009. Received call at 0347 regarding missing person, Harold Chin, 42, failed to return from evening hike. Conducted preliminary search at first light. Located subject's vehicle at Ironwood Falls parking area. Trail camera footage from previous evening shows subject leaving vehicle at 1823, walking toward trailhead. At 0214, camera captures subject returning to parking area, standing motionless beside vehicle for 11 minutes. At 0225, subject turns and walks directly into forest, not toward trail but into dense brush heading northeast. Subject is smiling. Expression does not change throughout recorded footage. Subject never found. The ranger logs continued in this vein, documenting incident after incident that could not be rationally explained. Animals dying in perfect circles. Hikers returning to their cars in the middle of the night only to walk immediately back into the wilderness. Strange lights observed in the deep forest. Sounds that defied identification. The whistle, I said, and Ranger Webb nodded slowly. I've heard it 7 times in 20 years, she said. Always between midnight and 4 in the morning. Always on nights when there's no wind. It comes from the northeast, from the old growth section that we don't let hikers enter. The sound carries for miles, but it's directional somehow. You can't quite pinpoint where it's coming from. It moves around you like it's circling. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper. The first time I heard it, I started walking. I was halfway to the tree line before I realized what I was doing. My legs were moving on their own. It took everything I had to stop, to turn around, to get back inside. I haven't gone out at night since then. Not for any reason. I asked her what she thought was making the sound. I don't know, she said. And I don't want to know. Some things aren't meant to be understood, Mr. Vance. Some things just are. The testimonies I gathered from the residents of Ironwood painted a consistent picture, though the details varied with each telling. Agnes Holloway, 78, had lost her husband Walter in the spring of 1994. She told me about the nights leading up to his disappearance, how he would stand at their bedroom window for hours, staring at the tree line, how he stopped eating and barely slept. He kept saying he could hear music, she said, her hands trembling around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The most beautiful music, he said. Like a pipe organ but alive. He said it was calling him, that it had something to show him. I tried to talk sense into him, but by the end he wasn't really Walter anymore. He was just a shell waiting for night to fall. On the night he vanished, Agnes had woken to find his side of the bed empty. She found him standing at the back door, naked despite the cold, his hand on the knob. He looked at me, she said, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. He looked right at me and smiled, and his eyes were empty. Not blank, not absent. Empty. Like whatever made him Walter had already left, and there was just this thing wearing his body. And then he opened the door and walked out into the dark, and I never saw him again. The folklore fragments I uncovered in the county historical archives painted an even darker picture. The indigenous peoples who had inhabited this region before European settlement had numerous stories about the forest, stories that the early settlers had dismissed as primitive superstition but which took on a more sinister significance in light of the disappearances. One account, transcribed by a missionary in 1847, described a creature that the local tribe called something that roughly translated to the one who plays the ribs. The account was fragmented, damaged by water and age, but the surviving passages were haunting. The elders speak of a hunger that walks the old forest, a thing that was here before the first people came to this land. It does not eat flesh, they say, but something deeper. It calls to the spirit with a sound made from the hollow bones of the earth, and those who hear the calling cannot resist. They walk into the forest seeking the source of the music, and they are never seen again. The elders say the creature is tall, taller than the tallest tree, with a body like a dead thing but with music in its chest, a music that reaches into the place where the soul lives. Another fragment, from a letter written by a logging foreman in 1912, described an incident that cost the local timber company half its workforce in a single night. The whistling began just after midnight. By dawn, 23 men had walked into the forest. We found no bodies, no equipment, nothing to suggest where they had gone. The remaining workers refused to continue operations. They speak of an old evil in these woods, something that has always been here, something that hungers for human souls. I am a practical man, but I cannot explain what happened that night. The company has ordered the logging operation closed. We are leaving this place and we will not return. As the days passed, I became increasingly aware that I was not merely documenting a series of unexplained disappearances. I was piecing together evidence of something much older and more terrible, something that had haunted these forests for centuries, something that continued to hunt even now. The police notes from recent investigations revealed a disturbing detail that I had not initially noticed. In every case from the past decade, the victim had been observed exhibiting unusual behavior in the days before their disappearance. They became withdrawn, lost interest in food and sleep, spent hours staring at windows or doors that faced the forest. Several had been caught attempting to leave their homes in the middle of the night, only to have no memory of the attempt when questioned the following morning. Detective Maria Santos, who had worked 7 of the most recent disappearances, agreed to meet with me at the Timberline on my 8th night in Ironwood. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that carried the weight of cases she had never been able to solve. "There's a pattern," she told me, speaking quietly despite the fact that we were the only customers in the diner. "Not in the victims but in the progression. It always starts the same way. They hear the whistle once, maybe twice, and they dismiss it. A strange noise in the night, nothing more. But then they start hearing it when no one else can. They hear it during the day in their homes, in their cars. It gets inside their heads and it doesn't leave." She pulled out a folder containing photocopied pages, journal entries from victims who had documented their experiences before they vanished. "Alice Drummond, disappeared March 2018, she said, sliding the first page across the table. She kept a diary. Read the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible in places, but I managed to decipher the words. It's not a whistle anymore. It's a voice. It's telling me there's something beautiful in the forest, something that will make all the pain go away. I know I shouldn't listen. I know what happens to people who listen. But the voice is so kind, so gentle. It knows my name. It knows everything about me. It says it's been waiting for me for a very long time. I don't think I can resist much longer. I don't think I want to." Alice Drummond had walked out of her apartment at 3:17 in the morning on March 23rd. Her body was never found. "They all say the same thing," Detective Santos said, gathering the papers back into her folder. "The voice knows them. It's been waiting for them. It promises them something beautiful. And then they walk into the forest and they're gone." I heard the whistle for the first time on my 12th night in Ironwood County. It was approximately 2:30 in the morning. I had fallen asleep at my desk, surrounded by case files and interview transcripts, and I woke with the sudden certainty that something had changed. The motel room was silent except for the rattle of the air conditioner, but there was a quality to the silence that felt wrong, a heaviness that pressed against my eardrums like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then I heard it. It was exactly as Donna had described, as Sheriff Hendricks had described, as every witness I had interviewed had described. A whistle, but not merely a whistle. It was a sound that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate somewhere deep in my chest, in the hollow place behind my ribs where my heart beat its steady rhythm. The whistle was achingly beautiful, a melody that contained within it every piece of music I had ever loved, every song that had ever moved me to tears. It was the sound of longing fulfilled, of emptiness made whole, of every unanswered question finally receiving its answer. I found myself standing at the window without remembering having gotten up from my chair. The forest was a wall of darkness beyond the motel parking lot, and somewhere in that darkness, the whistle continued its impossible song. I watched my hand reach for the window latch, watched my fingers begin to turn it, and for one eternal moment, I understood why people walked into those trees. The whistle promised something that could not be put into words, a peace so profound that death itself seemed like a small price to pay. What saved me was the rattle of the air conditioner. The unit chose that exact moment to shudder and cough, emitting a harsh mechanical groan that cut through the whistle's spell like a blade through silk. I stumbled backward, gasping, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The whistle faded, growing distant, disappointed, and then it was gone, leaving only silence and the lingering memory of a beauty that no longer seemed beautiful at all. I did not sleep again that night. I sat in the corner farthest from the window with headphones in my ears, playing music at maximum volume, terrified that the whistle would return. When dawn finally came, I packed my bags with shaking hands and drove to the ranger station, where Patricia Webb took one look at my face and knew exactly what had happened. "It found you," she said, not a question. "That's how it works. Once it knows you're here, once it knows you're looking for it, it starts looking back." She made me coffee and we sat on the porch as the morning fog lifted from the forest. I told her about the whistle, about the almost overwhelming compulsion to open that window and walk into the dark. She listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, her expression grave. "The first time is always the worst," she said when I finished. "The surprise of it, the way it catches you off guard. It gets easier to resist after that, but it never goes away entirely. Once you've heard it, you'll always hear it. It's in your head now, waiting." I asked her what she knew about the source of the whistle, and she was quiet for a long time before answering. "There's an old cabin about 15 miles northeast of here," she said finally. "Deep in the old-growth section, on land that's been off-limits since before the county was incorporated. The official story is that the cabin was built by a trapper in the 1800s, that it's structurally unsound and dangerous. But that's not why it's off-limits." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded photograph, yellowed with age, and handed it to me. The image showed a clearing in a dense forest, and in the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied easy description. It was nominally a cabin, but it had been modified, expanded, transformed into something else entirely. Bones protruded from its walls, large bones that could only have come from something massive and ancient. The roof was a tangle of antlers and branches woven together in patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. And in front of the cabin, barely visible in the photograph's grainy resolution, stood a figure. The figure was tall. Impossibly tall. Its limbs were thin and elongated, jointed in too many places, and its torso was a hollow cage of what appeared to be enormous ribs, spread apart like the pipes of an organ. Where its face should have been, there was only shadow, but I could see the faint suggestion of a mouth that was open, a mouth that was making the sound that I had heard the night before. "This photograph was taken in 1957, Ranger Webb said, by a man named Donald Haskins. He was part of a survey team mapping the old-growth forest. He took this picture, walked out of the forest, showed it to his superiors, and 3 days later he walked back in. His body was never found. Neither were the bodies of the 4 other men on his survey team." I asked her who else knew about this photograph, about the cabin, about the creature. "Enough people," she said. "The old families, the ones who have been here since the beginning. They know. They've always known. It's why they stay, Mr. Vance. They think their presence keeps the creature contained, keeps it focused on this one area. They sacrifice their own, 1 or 2 every year, to protect everyone else." The implications of what she was saying slowly sank in. I asked her if she was suggesting that the residents of Ironwood were deliberately feeding people to this creature. "Not deliberately," she said. "Not consciously. But they don't leave. They don't warn outsiders. They let the creature take who it takes, and they tell themselves it's the price of living here. It's been this way for generations. It will be this way long after we're all gone." That afternoon, I drove to the county administrative building and descended into the basement where the case files were stored. I had reviewed these files many times before, but now I was looking for something specific, a pattern I had previously missed. Took me 3 hours, but I found it. The disappearances followed a cycle. Every 6 to 8 weeks, someone vanished. The timing was too regular to be coincidental, too consistent to be the result of random predation. Whatever was out there, whatever had made that whistle, it was feeding on a schedule. I cross-referenced the disappearances with other records I had gathered: local birth certificates, death certificates, census data. The population of Ironwood County had remained remarkably stable over the past century, never growing beyond a certain point, never shrinking below another. New families arrived to replace the ones that were taken. The cycle continued. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Father Michael Brennan, the elderly priest who ran Ironwood's small church, agreed to meet with me after the evening service. He was a frail man in his 80s, and he spoke with the careful deliberation of someone who was choosing each word with great care. "The church has records that go back to the founding of this parish in 1889, he told me. "I have read every entry in those records. I know what resides in the forest, Mr. Vance. I have known since I was a young priest, when my predecessor passed his knowledge to me just as his predecessor had passed it to him." He opened a leather-bound journal and began to read. "There exists in the old forest a creature of profound age and insatiable hunger. It was here before the first humans came to this land, and it will be here long after the last human has departed. It feeds not on flesh but on the soul itself, drawing victims to their doom with a sound that bypasses the mind and speaks directly to the spirit. Those who hear its call and succumb are consumed, their essence absorbed into the creature's eternal hunger. The creature cannot be killed, cannot be driven away, can only be appeased through regular tribute." I asked Father Brennan if the church condoned this, and he looked at me with eyes that held decades of sorrow and guilt. "The church does what it must to protect its flock," he said. "We cannot fight what cannot be fought. We can only endure and pray and hope that someday, somehow, the creature will move on and leave us in peace." That night, I made a decision that I would later come to regret. I would find the cabin. I would document what was there. I would bring evidence back that could not be ignored, could not be explained away, could not be buried in the basement of some county building. The creature had been allowed to hunt for too long because people were afraid to confront it directly. I would not be afraid. I was wrong. I left the motel at dawn on my 14th day in Ironwood County. My backpack contained a camera, a voice recorder, a GPS unit, emergency supplies, and a printout of the map I had constructed by cross-referencing Donald Haskins' photograph with modern satellite imagery. The cabin was approximately 15 miles into the restricted section of the forest, accessible only by following a series of old logging roads that had long since been reclaimed by vegetation. Ranger Webb tried to stop me. She was waiting at the trailhead when I arrived, her truck blocking the path, her face a mask of barely controlled fear. "You can't do this," she said. "You don't understand what you're walking into." I told her I understood perfectly. I had spoken with Father Brennan. I had seen the photograph. I knew what was out there. "Knowing and understanding are different things," she said. "That creature has been feeding on humans for centuries, maybe longer. It's not an animal, Mr. Vance. It's not something you can document and expose. It's something else entirely. Something that exists outside the categories we use to make sense of the world." I thanked her for her concern and asked her to move her truck. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her eyes, a resignation that frightened me more than anything she had said. "If you make it back," she said, "find me. Tell me what you saw." She moved her truck. I drove past her and into the forest. The first few hours of my journey were unremarkable. The logging roads were overgrown but navigable, and my GPS guided me steadily northeast, deeper into the old-growth section of the forest. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than my car, their canopy so dense that the sunlight filtering through had a greenish, aquatic quality. There was no birdsong, I realized. No insect buzz. No sound at all except the crunch of my tires on the decaying road surface. I abandoned my car when the road became impassable and continued on foot, following compass bearings through increasingly dense underbrush. The forest changed as I walked deeper. The trees grew older, more twisted, their branches reaching toward each other like grasping fingers. The light dimmed even though midday was still hours away. And gradually, so gradually that I almost didn't notice at first, a smell began to permeate the air. It was a smell of decay, of ancient rot, but underneath it was something else, something that reminded me of burnt metal and ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. I found the first bones at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They were human bones, scattered among the roots of an enormous oak tree, bleached white by years of exposure. There was no way to identify who they had belonged to. There was no way to know how long they had been there. But as I continued walking, I found more. Many more. The forest floor was littered with them, partially buried in leaf litter, caught in tangles of undergrowth, arranged in patterns that might have been deliberate or might have been the random distribution of decades of remains. I documented everything. I photographed the bones, recording their GPS coordinates, noting the condition of each find. I told myself I was doing important work, that this evidence would finally force authorities to acknowledge what was happening in Ironwood County. I told myself I was not afraid. But I was lying. The cabin appeared as the light began to fail. It was exactly as it had looked in the 1957 photograph, except older, more decayed, more wrong. The bones that protruded from its walls had multiplied over the decades, and I realized with mounting horror that they were not animal bones but human bones, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, woven into the structure of the cabin like some grotesque architectural element. The antlers on the roof had grown, spreading outward in fractal patterns that made my head ache to look at directly. And the front door of the cabin was open, revealing only darkness within. I set up my camera on a tripod and began to record. I documented the exterior of the cabin from every angle, narrating my observations in a voice that I barely recognized as my own. As I worked, the light continued to fade and I became aware that I needed to leave, needed to get out of the forest before night fell. But something held me in place. Curiosity, perhaps. Or something else, something that had been growing in me since I first heard the whistle, a compulsion that I had been fighting since that night in the motel room. I walked toward the open door. The interior of the cabin was not what I expected. It was larger than it should have been, the walls receding into shadows that my flashlight could not penetrate. The floor was earthen, packed hard by countless feet over countless years, and in the center of the floor was a pit, a shaft that descended into absolute darkness. The smell was overwhelming here, rot and ozone and something else, something organic and pulsing like the inside of a living body. And then I heard the whistle. It came from the pit, rising up from the darkness like a physical thing, wrapping around me, entering me, filling every empty space in my body and mind. It was more beautiful than I remembered, more beautiful than anything I had ever experienced, and I understood in that moment why people walked into the forest, why they surrendered to the call, why they gave themselves willingly to whatever waited in the dark. The whistle was not merely a sound. It was a promise. A promise of peace, of release, of an end to every pain and fear and doubt that had ever plagued my existence. The creature that made that sound was not a predator in any conventional sense. It was a mercy, a gift, a doorway to something beyond the grinding horror of mortal life. I found myself walking toward the pit. My flashlight illuminated the edges of the shaft, and I saw that there were handholds carved into the stone, a ladder descending into the earth. How many feet had worn those handholds smooth? How many hands had gripped those stones on their way down into the dark? I reached out to begin my descent. A sound stopped me. Not the whistle, but something else, something ordinary and out of place. A bird's call, distant but clear, cutting through the whistle's hypnotic beauty. I blinked, and for a moment the spell broke. I saw what I was about to do. I saw the pit yawning beneath me, ready to swallow me whole. I saw the bones on the cabin walls, the remains of everyone who had heard the whistle and followed its call. I ran. The forest was alive around me, branches whipping at my face, roots grabbing at my feet. The whistle pursued me, growing louder, more insistent, its beautiful promise curdling into something else, something angry and hungry and ancient. I crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed for mercy. And all the while, I could feel it behind me, could sense its presence in the darkness, could hear the whistle transforming into something that was no longer music but a scream of frustrated hunger. I do not know how I found my way back to my car. I do not know how I managed to start the engine with hands that shook so badly I could barely grip the keys. I do not know how I navigated those overgrown roads in darkness so complete that my headlights seemed to illuminate only feet ahead. But I emerged from the forest at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, and I drove straight to the ranger station, where Patricia Webb was waiting. She took one look at me and knew. She didn't ask what I had seen. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply handed me a cup of coffee and sat with me as the sun rose, as the darkness retreated, as the whistle's echo gradually faded from my mind. "Now you understand," she said finally. I nodded. I understood. The creature in the forest was real, and it was hungry, and there was nothing that human beings could do to stop it. The disappearances would continue. The cycle would persist. And the people of Ironwood would go on living in the shadow of something that had been there since before memory, something that would be there long after they were all gone. I thought I had escaped. I thought I could leave Ironwood County and never return, could go back to my ordinary life and forget what I had experienced in those dark woods. I thought the whistle had released me. I was wrong about that too. I left Ironwood County 3 days after my encounter at the cabin. I packed my equipment, deleted all the photographs I had taken, destroyed my notes and recordings. I drove south without stopping, putting as many miles as possible between myself and the forest, telling myself that distance would break whatever connection the creature had established during that terrible night. For 2 months it seemed to work. I returned to my apartment in Portland, resumed my life, began working on other stories. The memory of Ironwood faded into something that felt almost like a dream, unreal and distant. I stopped thinking about the whistle. I stopped dreaming about the pit. And then, on a quiet Tuesday evening in January, I heard it again. I was sitting in my living room, reading, when the sound cut through the silence like a blade. The whistle. The same beautiful, terrible, impossible whistle that I had heard in the motel room, that had called to me from the cabin's darkness. It was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. And it was coming from outside my window. My apartment is in downtown Portland, on the 7th floor of a building surrounded by concrete and steel. The nearest forest is miles away. But when I went to the window and looked out into the night, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The trees were there. They shouldn't have been there. There were no trees in that direction, nothing but parking lots and office buildings and the glittering lights of the city. But I could see them clearly, a line of ancient pines stretching along the horizon, and between the trees, barely visible in the darkness, a tall figure stood watching my window. I stumbled backward and the vision vanished. The city returned, normal and mundane, the trees and the figure gone as if they had never been there. But the whistle remained, faint but persistent, a melody that seemed to resonate from the walls of my apartment, from the floor beneath my feet, from somewhere deep inside my own skull. That was 3 weeks ago. The whistle has grown louder every night since. I have tried everything. I have consulted doctors who found nothing wrong with my hearing, nothing wrong with my brain. I have sought out spiritual healers and folklorists and anyone else who might offer an explanation or a cure. I have taken sleeping pills that no longer work and worn headphones that no longer block the sound. The whistle is inside me now, a part of me, a second heartbeat that grows stronger with each passing hour. I know what is happening. I have read the journals of those who disappeared, the desperate final entries describing this exact progression. The creature marked me that night in the cabin. It let me run because it knew I could not escape, knew that sooner or later the whistle would bring me back. Distance means nothing to something that exists outside the normal rules of space and time. The forest is not merely a location. It is a doorway, and that doorway can open anywhere. Last night, I woke to find myself standing at my apartment door, my hand on the knob, my feet bare against the cold floor. I do not remember getting out of bed. I do not remember walking across the room. But I remember what I was dreaming, the beautiful dream of peace and release that the whistle promises, the dream of walking into darkness and never walking out again. I have perhaps a week left. Maybe less. The compulsion is growing stronger, and my ability to resist is growing weaker. Soon there will come a night when I do not wake up in time, when I do not catch myself at the door. I will walk out of this building and into the streets, and I will follow the whistle to whatever place it leads, and I will join the 63 people who have vanished from Ironwood County over the past 32 years. I will become number 64. This document is my final record, my attempt to leave something behind that might help others understand what happened to me and what continues to happen in Ironwood County. I am uploading it to multiple servers, sending copies to every journalist and researcher I know, hoping that someone will take up the investigation where I was forced to abandon it. The creature must be stopped. The cycle must be broken. The people of Ironwood cannot continue sacrificing their neighbors to appease something that should not exist. But I fear that my efforts will be in vain. The creature has survived for centuries because it cannot be fought with conventional means. It exists in a space between reality and nightmare, hunting through sound and dream and the desperate human longing for release from suffering. How do you kill something that feeds on the desire for peace? How do you defeat something that offers exactly what every tormented soul secretly wants? I hear the whistle now as I write these words. It is louder than ever, a symphony of beautiful agony that fills my apartment, my mind, my soul. I see the trees outside my window, the impossible forest that has followed me from Ironwood, and standing at the edge of the trees, visible now in moonlight that should not be able to penetrate downtown Portland's light pollution, the creature waits. It is exactly as the photograph showed. Tall beyond reason, limbed like something that has never walked on human soil, its torso a cage of enormous ribs spread apart like the pipes of an organ. And now, in the pale light, I can see what I could not see in the grainy 1957 image. The ribs are moving. They are flexing in and out like the bellows of an accordion, like the lungs of something impossibly vast, and with each flex they produce the whistle, the call, the song that has pursued me across hundreds of miles and will pursue me to the end of my days. The creature's face is still hidden in shadow, but I know it is watching me. I know it has been watching me since that first night in the motel, since the moment I began asking questions about the disappearances, since the instant I decided to uncover the truth about Ironwood County. Perhaps it has been watching me even longer than that. Perhaps it has been waiting for me since before I was born, since before my parents were born, since some ancient moment when my name was written in whatever passes for the creature's memory. I'm going to the door now. The whistle is too strong, too beautiful, too full of promises that I no longer have the strength to refuse. I am going to walk out of this apartment and into the night, and I am going to follow the sound to wherever it leads. I am going to find out what waits at the bottom of that pit, in the darkness beneath the cabin, in the heart of the forest that has called to humans since before recorded history. Perhaps I will find the peace that the whistle promises. Perhaps I will find only oblivion. But I will find something, and after so many weeks of fighting, after so many nights of resistance, the idea of finally letting go is almost a relief. If you are reading this, please do not come looking for me. Please do not make the mistake I made. The creature is real, and it is hungry, and once it knows you are seeking it, it will never stop seeking you in return. The door is open now. The night air is cold against my skin. The forest is calling and I am going to answer. I can hear the whistle. It knows my name. Goodbye. The body of Daniel Vance was never recovered. His apartment was found empty on the morning of February 3, 2020, the front door standing open despite the freezing temperatures outside. Security footage from the building showed Vance leaving his apartment at 3:47 a.m. and walking calmly toward the elevator, a slight smile on his face. He was barefoot and wearing only a t-shirt and boxers, but he showed no signs of distress. Building security cameras tracked him to the lobby and out the front entrance. Street cameras captured him walking north on 5th Avenue for approximately 3 blocks before the footage became corrupted, filled with static and strange geometric patterns that technicians could not explain. The final clear frame showed Daniel Vance standing at a street corner, looking at something off camera, his expression one of profound peace. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows between buildings, something tall and thin appeared to be waiting. The case file for Daniel Vance remains open. His documents were recovered from his apartment, along with extensive files on the Ironwood County disappearances. Local authorities in Portland dismissed his writings as the product of mental illness. The Ironwood County Sheriff's Department declined to comment. 3 weeks after Daniel Vance's disappearance, a woman named Catherine Mills walked out of her home in Salem, Oregon, barefoot and smiling, following a sound that no one else could hear. She was never seen again. The whistle continues.